Hello, my name is Jonathan Foyles. I am the author of This City is Killing Me, Community Trauma and Toxic Stress in Urban America. Came out last year from Belt Publishing. And I'm here to share a little bit of what led me to write the book and then to read a little bit for you all. Really happy to be here supporting the Chicago Public Library. In many ways, I don't think the book would have existed or could have existed without all of the services they offer. And certainly my library card has gotten quite a bit of use over the years, even in these days that we're in right now of social distancing and social isolation. I think being able to check out books, even ebooks and whatnot, is a way of still feeling connected to people and part of something larger than oneself that I think is extremely vital. And so I'm glad that they're doing things such as this to help us connect with one another. Even though this doesn't replace meeting in person, I do think that this is a good way for us all to stay connected. And I am glad to be with you all, even albeit virtually. So I thought I would start by sharing a little bit about what led me to write this book. I am a licensed clinical social worker, which means that I'm a social worker by training, and I have extra training and a license to practice psychotherapy. For 5 years, I worked in a community mental health center associated with a safety net hospital on the west side of Chicago. And given the scarcity of mental health resources, that meant that we would see clients from all across the city, but particularly from the south and west sides, since those areas are chronically underdeveloped in terms of their mental health infrastructure. And one thing that I found through my work there is, one, that I really liked it and that I really connected with the clients that I saw, and that I just felt like the work wasn't very meaningful. But also that a lot of the frameworks, the modalities that I had learned in graduate school, as helpful as they are in some settings, didn't really seem to apply fully to the sort of population that I was serving. One of the time-honored, research-backed, things for helping someone cope with depression, anxiety, and a whole host of forms of mental suffering is to, get outside, get some exercise, that sort of thing. And I think, for some of us, depending on where we live, that's quite easy and doable and has obvious benefits. But for other people living in neighborhoods that are marred by gun violence, where they don't feel safe, where there just aren't public spaces really available for walking around, or where such things would be sort of odd and make you stick out, possibly in a dangerous way. Those sort of suggestions just didn't work, and that went from everything from the, sort of small stuff like that to the larger scale theories about, how the mind works and how, when the mind suffers, how it can be best helped. And so I, through my work, realized that we needed a new framework for talking about these things. And I don't claim to have invented this framework. I think my goal in the book is just to take a lot of the sort of lived on the ground experience of myself and my colleagues, and of course of our clients, and to translate that a bit, and to just expand it and give a vocabulary to it. So that's one of the things that I hope to accomplish with this book. So I'd like to start by reading from the introduction, just to sort of set the scene for what this book is and what it hopes to accomplish. We diagnose people, not cultures or neighborhoods, with depression. This singular focus can help obscure the environmental factors that contribute to mental illness and minimize the contributions our society makes to the mental suffering of the poor. It is far easier to feel depressed if you live in a neighborhood that has experienced chronic disinvestment, has few supportive community resources available, and is marred by gun violence. This also makes it much more difficult to treat. How does one heal a whole neighborhood? I can do my best work as a therapist to help someone improve, but there is only so much that can be accomplished in individual therapy before we run up against the structures that continue to perpetuate such suffering. We need to cast a bigger vision. In public health, these outside factors that impact the functioning of individuals within their communities are known as, quote, social determinants of health, end quote. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, such factors include unstable housing, low income, unsafe neighborhoods, and poor education. I will be utilizing this framework throughout the book to analyze how policy decisions and priorities have negatively influenced the mental health of my patients, but I want to take this conversation a step further. Consider employment as an example. It's fairly obvious from the data that being unemployed or underemployed can be deleterious to one's physical and mental health. One solution that is often proposed is workplace development programs. These can indeed help, but what if there simply aren't jobs located within the community because of systematic disinvestment? What if the jobs which are available are mostly within the retail and service sectors and don't pay a living wage? What if the employers refuse to hire someone who has been incarcerated? What if the jobs don't allow flexible scheduling so parents can be present for their children? And how did these communities get stuck with such poor employment options in the first place? We need a framework that recognizes these systemic issues and how they disproportionately affect people in communities of color. We have a framework in mental health for understanding the ways in which a traumatic event can impact an individual, post-traumatic stress disorder. We haven't done nearly as good of a job at accounting for the other mechanisms by which outside events impact a person and a community's well-being. In this book, I will talk about some individual traumas, but my focus will be upon larger traumas that occur within a community, such as unemployment, poverty, lack of affordable housing, and violence, and within history, such as Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, forced displacement, and redlining. These traumas exert a different sort of pressure upon the individual, creating what's known as toxic stress. Consider this example. Two young boys are bullied at school. The first boy, Michael, goes home with his grandmother, who talks to him about it, makes him a snack, and helps him forget about it for the evening. She also resolves to address it the next day with his teacher so it doesn't become a larger issue. Michael went home in an emotionally aroused state, but due to attentive caregiving, he is calm by the time he goes to sleep and isn't bothered by the time he goes to school the next morning. Thomas is also bullied, but his experience is different. His caregivers have to work irregular hours to make ends meet, so when he goes home, a neighbor is nearby to keep an eye on him, but Thomas doesn't have anyone to talk to right away. His emotional arousal level stays high. His parents finally arrive at home, and right after dinner, his father starts drinking. His stress level increases. He goes to his room because he knows what comes next. He can hear his father slapping his mother around and calling her names. He is unable to talk to anyone about being bullied, and he is more stressed when he goes to sleep than he was when he came home. He goes to school in the morning more anxious than when he left, is bullied again, and his stress skyrockets. If these conditions continue for Thomas, he will be at great risk for both physical and mental health issues down the line. He will have a greater chance of being unemployed or underemployed, have more relational instability, express less satisfaction with his overall life, and will most likely die sooner. Now imagine communities that, because of constantly cascading waves of trauma upon every level, are made up almost entirely of Thomases. These are the conditions we have created in urban areas throughout the country. That is a little section from the introduction of the book, just setting up the concerns that illuminate it and establishing the sort of theoretical framework where I'm going to tackle things. And this is a very Chicago-based book. I think you could write a book like this about pretty much every major city in America. Nobody really does good by the poor, and especially when it comes to their mental health. But with the Chicago focus, I look at, in the introduction and throughout the successive chapters, about how the events of the last decade or so have further cemented inequities that have existed for a long time. So the closing of 50 schools, primarily on the south and west sides, the closing of 6 community mental health centers run by the city, predominantly on the south and west sides, the high level of gun violence, which we at one point we thought peaked in 2016, but this year has also been quite difficult. So we might be in for another hard year when it comes to that, again, predominantly affecting the south and west sides. And these sort of things don't often get talked about at all. We tend to have short memories for these sort of things because I think it often makes us uncomfortable. And I think that when we do talk about them, we tend to talk about them as isolated incidents. There's the education beat, and the health beat and whatnot. And that's a way that we make sense of things, we being people who don't live in these areas and don't have our lives impacted in these ways. But for those who do live there, they don't have the luxury of experiencing them as separate, and what they feel, and what they sort of told me they feel over and over is a feeling of being not valued, of being left behind, being abandoned. Not just on a city level, but on the state level and the federal level as well. And so I think that, all of these things, profoundly impact people's mental health, creating forms of mental suffering where they didn't exist before, and then also exacerbating suffering that already existed, and also limiting the solutions available to that suffering. So the form that this book takes after the introduction is 5 case studies from throughout my practice in community mental health. I talk about a client who I call Jacqueline, who is a transgender Latinx woman who had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, but to me that diagnosis seemed to go hand in hand with the sort of trauma that she had experienced quite pervasively throughout her life, whether it was homophobia before her transition, transphobia later, the everyday threats of violence that she faced for being a transgender woman of color, and the ways in which all of those things don't contribute to the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder in terms of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, the book, the Bible of sorts that therapists like myself use to assign diagnoses to people. None of those sort of outside social factors are considered symptoms, but throughout Jacqueline's treatment, it became clear to me that one could not separate these things in any real and meaningful way. I also talk about Frida, someone who had her children taken away from her through DCFS due to neglect and what she would characterize as a mistake, and chronicle her own traumatic childhood, the ways in which the death of her father further complicated all of these things, and the struggles that she faced in getting her children back. I go on then to talk about Robert, who had a quite fantastic story that many found difficult to believe, and that seemed to be almost drawn from the pages of a thriller novel, about being this sort of secret African royalty who was persecuted by people who kidnapped him from birth. And I came to understand that as a way of just dealing with the profound traumas he'd experienced, and I look at how that intersects with the history of the Chicago Housing Authority in general, since that is where Robert grew up. And then I also look at the life of Luis, who was a Latinx man who had a complicated relationship with his family, who had dreams of being great, even grandiose at times, and who had managed to achieve some success when he was an adolescent. He got into a selective enrollment in high school, but only managed to last a short time there before he failed out due to, in part, just the lack of support for students like him, and how, considering how those earlier educational lapses impacted the course of his life and his illness, and the ways in which he had available to him to get better. And then finally, I consider Anthony, and Anthony's who I'm going to read from in just a second here. And Anthony was someone who lost his son to gun violence, and I'm going to leave it there and then go into the opening of the chapter on Anthony here. Knocking on the frame of my open door, one of my coworkers leaned in and said, "I have a new client for you. I just did his intake and I think he needs to talk to someone soon." "Okay," I told her. "I'll set him up with an appointment." "Are you free right now?" "Just for a few minutes. He really needs it. His name is Anthony. He's right out here in the waiting room. Let me introduce you." Later I would find out the depths of Anthony's pain, but the moment he stepped into my office I could see he was suffering. He was wearing all black and his arms were coiled tightly around his core. He was in his early 40s but appeared much older, not just due to his thinning hair which he kept closely shaved. His eyes glanced at me suspiciously from behind his thick glasses. He was of an average height and weight, but his posture made him seem smaller. He largely kept to the same position over our first few sessions, but he did soften slightly the more we got to know each other. Anthony was born to a father who was emotionally abusive and a mother who was overwhelmed. They had too many children, he told me, so his mother picked a few to send back to their native Mexico. Anthony was forced to move there when he was 8. He didn't know a word of Spanish. His paternal grandmother made him work in the fields and whipped him when he was disobedient. School became a distant memory. When he turned 13, his mother brought him back to the United States. He enrolled in school again, but was hopelessly behind. He could not read or write, and he was discovering that he preferred to stay in the streets rather than go to school. Anthony was in and out of juvenile institutions until he was 17. He got his girlfriend pregnant, and they got married when they were both 18. He tried to stay out of trouble and found a job working in a factory. Fortunately, he had a sympathetic supervisor that helped cover for him, so no one would find out he was illiterate. Anthony had few allies at work. Native Mexicans mocked his poor Spanish, and most of his other co-workers wrote him off as undocumented and therefore disposable. His supervisor retired, and his successor was not as kind. Anthony endured it for a few more years until he quit. He probably would have had to leave the job soon anyway. He had developed carpal tunnel syndrome, and his right hand remained claw-like and numb even following surgery. Around the time his job was falling apart, Anthony came home to discover his wife in bed with another man. He admitted that their relationship wasn't really working by this point, but he was still shocked. They divorced, and their 3 children, who were now teenagers, lived with their mother and visited Anthony on the weekend. All of this would have been more than enough to leave its mark, and we certainly processed these events over time. But it was not the years of childhood abuse, the workplace harassment, or the divorce that Anthony needed to talk about the most. In his telling, his life ended 9 years ago. It was his son's 16th birthday. They had plans to celebrate that evening, but during the day his son was wandering around the neighborhood and talking to his friends. Anthony hadn't seen him as much lately and was feeling worried, as fathers do. His son was walking into a corner store a few blocks from his house when a minivan pulled up beside him. 3 males barely older than him were inside. Words were exchanged. One of them jumped out of the van and shot his son in the head. He crumpled to the sidewalk, dying instantly. When a child dies, you mourn not just the life that was lost, but all of the life that could have been, but now will never be. Anthony loved sports, but every time he sat down to watch a Bears game, he remembered how he and his son used to watch them together. He thought about dating, but then felt guilty about being with someone his son would never meet. As his daughters grew and experienced the heartaches and pains of adulthood, he wondered what sort of man his son would have been. It was tearing him apart. So that's how Anthony came to me. And I share his story not because it's atypical, although I do find it moving, and over the time that Anthony and I worked together, we developed what I believe is a profound bond and did a lot of really good work together in helping him process his trauma and sort of move on with his life. But I don't think Anthony's story is unique, sadly so, and I think in some ways it's even different because as you'll see later in the chapter if you pick it up, Anthony's experience was unlike that of many other people in Chicago who lose relatives to gun violence because his son's murderers were apprehended and convicted, although one of them did abscond. The 2 of them are incarcerated currently for the murder, and I don't think that gave Anthony the sort of relief that he thought. At times he thought that if they caught the one who had fled, that would somehow be the thing that would finally bring him closure, but I think in his heart of hearts he knew that it wouldn't, and I think that having the perpetrators brought to justice is a gift that not many families in Chicago get, but even then it was, nothing could bring his son back in any way that would be meaningful to him, and I think I wrote this a few years ago, and I think it's hard not to think about the difficult summer in particular that we've had here and the number of children, like Anthony's son, who have been murdered, who've been caught in the crosshairs of gang violence, and just to wonder how many other Anthonys are out there. I think it's far too many, and I think one of my motivations in writing this book is, it's easy as we watch the news and sort of think through the things that are affecting our city to be moved, to even be moved deeply sometimes, but to not to struggle to understand the full import of it. I think as humans we are sort of a story creating species, and I think that we understand things the most when they come to us in a narrative form, and I think that looking at statistics of gun violence or even the number of children murdered, horrendous as it is, can in some ways not bring it home. Sometimes it takes sort of confronting one of these stories like Anthony's face to face to understand the lived impact of those sort of things, and that really was one of my goals in writing this book, is to take some of these stories that we see and perhaps think about for a day or two and then pass on, and showing how they continue to echo in the lives of those who are most impacted by them, and how this combines to create communities that are traumatized, that are profoundly marked and by the injustices that we see, unfortunately, in our city. And So over the time that I worked with Anthony, we did begin to build a bond, you know, and I think we did do, um, some really good work together. And so I want to talk a little bit here about what I think we were able to accomplish. Let's see. Um, yeah. Anthony had lost his apartment due both to the fog of grief and being unable to find a job that would hire him. When he had worked earlier, his wife had helped him fill out the necessary applications and was able to fake the rest of it. But as even low-paying jobs require a high school degree these days, his options were quite limited. He sometimes helped a friend with odd jobs for $100 or so in cash a day when the work was available, but soon this friend stopped being so regular with paying him and then refused altogether. Anthony moved between the apartments of his mother and his daughter, but more often the former, as his daughter had 2 small children to care for. Anthony's resentment of his mother began to grow as he progressed in treatment. So as we worked on treating the trauma associated with his son's death, as often happens, other things came to the fore. As is so often the case, something was sort of dominating his pain in his mind as he came to treatment. But once that was started to be addressed in some way, a lot of other things kind of rose to take its place. Questions that he had buried began to arise in his mind. Why did he have to go to Mexico and not one of his brothers? Why did she let his father verbally abuse him? Why hadn't she pushed him to go to school? Anthony asked all of these questions of her regularly, and her answer was usually something along the lines of, "That was in the past. You should forget about it and move on." Anthony didn't, and I think there was something therapeutic about his anger. I didn't want him to bully his mother, of course, and I don't think he ever did. Still, I think asking why and waiting for a real answer helped him express feelings towards her that he had long buried in his attempt to be a dutiful son. We typically associate why questions with young children, learning to be curious about their world and the whole notion of causality. I think Anthony's questions allowed him to return to that time, to ask his mother the questions he didn't have a voice for back then, and in the process to overcome a developmental impasse. Anthony never got the answer that he wanted from these questions, and I'm not sure such an answer exists anyway. He did learn to be comfortable with his questions and to hold both his present experience and his regrets and tension. He still thought of his son while watching football games, but he was able to both feel grief for his loss and enjoy the game, at least for most of it. After a long struggle, he also began to receive disability benefits. Although the amount he received each month was quite meager, having any kind of income allowed him to reclaim some small measure of self-respect. When Anthony and I wrapped up our work, he had recently moved into an apartment in his old neighborhood. Before he received Social Security, he would often talk about moving away to somewhere like Florida, far from the painful memories associated with Chicago. But his granddaughters were also here, and he enjoyed walking them to and from school every day. His route took him near where his son had been killed, and while this was difficult at first, the pain faded somewhat over time. He marveled at his own ability to cope. Anthony took his mother into his new apartment along with one of his brothers who was down on his luck. This arrangement wasn't perfect. Some of the same tensions are present. This switch from the cared for to the caregiver was an important milestone for Anthony, though. His self-image as needy and broken fell away as he found real meaning in caring for his mother in the last years of her life. There are a lot of Anthonys in Chicago. There are also a lot of residents who lacked some of the necessary supports he had, who had to contend with unsolved murders, few family members, and no money. And of course, there are plenty of people like me here too, who hear about violence on the news and maybe have a shooting in their neighborhood once or twice a year, which camp you fall into is often a matter of where you can afford to live. And then in conclusion, I talk a little bit about what I think this all means, and I think the most important thing is to listen, I think so many of these people I would not have come into contact with if I didn't do this sort of work, and I wager that many of you wouldn't either. So part of the goal in writing this was just to elevate their stories and let them speak as much as they could, with me sort of receding to the background, just to be heard as they deserve to be heard. And my goal is not, at the same time, it's not inspirational. I think in this sort of genre, like with someone like Anthony, Anthony was, by all accounts, doing pretty good. When we wrapped up our work, he was satisfied in many substantive ways and had improved. And that took a lot of hard work on his part, but and I want to honor that, respect that, and I think we certainly should. But I also think that the danger, even in sharing a story of like moderate success like Anthony, is that sometimes it can cast aspersions or cast um, you know, doubt upon people who aren't able to find that sort of healing or success, you know. And I think, as I tried to point out a little bit, you know, in the book, a lot of what, even though Anthony was someone who had fewer resources than many, there were some ways in which, you know, he had family around. He didn't be, even though he was couch surfing, he wasn't, you know, streets based homeless. You know, he had some ability to bring in small amounts of income. You know, he received some amount of justice. You know, none of these things are perfect, or you know, even profoundly remarkable in their own right, but they all add up to you know, some ways in which he was more advantaged than others. You know, and I think, you know, in a city where most of the murders go unsolved and you know, barely investigated, I think his certainly is an outlier in that regard. And so I don't want to offer the sort of inspirational uplift that makes it sound like everyone else should accomplish what Anthony did or what my other clients did, because they're all still in the thick of life, you know, just like we are. And I don't think they should be pitied either. You know, I don't think they would want that. I've never met a client who thought that was helpful or appropriate, you know, to be an object of pity. You know, they want help. They want to do better, you know, and that often means that they need more resources. And this is, you know, one of the ways in which I think being a social worker helps, because I think that you know, social workers tend to be pretty scrappy and adaptive, you know, and so I've never found it to be sort of a professional conflict to say help someone with their mental health concerns while also helping them look for jobs, you know, and that's something I think the strength of my field. Yeah, you know, and I think that it's, you know, it's interesting. As I said, this came out last August, before the events of this past summer and the increased attention paid to Black Lives Matter, to, you know, police brutality, through just the sort of conditions that define a lot of the urban areas in our city. And so I think that, you know, the conclusions of the book remain relevant. You know, the stuff which is examined is stuff that is on our minds. And I think that seeing the sort of upswing in activism certainly gives me hope, you know, and I don't think this book or any book is a reason to feel hopeless, because I think if you give in to feeling hopeless, then you just guarantee that these sort of conditions will continue, you know. And I think that the sort of things which structured the inequities that I chronicle in my book, you know, Jim Crow, redlining, white supremacy in all of its various forms, you know, and ableism, homophobia, you know, those things as well, you know, that have been around for centuries, you know, and I don't think we need to let that discourage us, but I also think we need to recognize, you know, the forces we're working against have deep roots, and so it will take persistent work. But as we've seen, you know, even just over the summer, sometimes change can happen quite quickly, you know, and then of course we want to make sure to solidify it, make sure it sticks around. But I think there's always reason to be hopeful, and you know, even in the midst of a, you know, once in a lifetime pandemic, I see a lot of glimmers of hope. And so, you know, even though, you know, a book called "The City Is Killing Me" is not a beach read necessarily, you know, I think it's a I wanted to make the argument, you know, so that people can know a little bit more about the forces that shape lives in our city, particularly those lives that we often don't encounter, and then just to point out some ways in which we could do a little bit better. So that's my hope with this book. I'm really excited to share a little bit of it with you today. As I said, it came out last year through Belt Publishing, and again, the title is "This City Is Killing Me: Community Trauma and Toxic Stress in Urban America." Well, thanks for watching, and take care.